Hi everyone, thank you once again for joining me. I'm Elizabeth Upenieks, the curatorial assistant here at deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum, and I'm really excited to share my exhibition, What We Do in the Shadows, with you all today. So the talk will be about 45 minutes long and hopefully leave some time for questions or comments at the end, but please feel free to send them in as I go along. So What We Do in the Shadows, it recently opened just about 2 weeks ago. And the concept of the show came from my own interest in social justice and protest, and was really reignited by the protests last summer and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the show is pulled predominantly from the permanent collection at deCordova, and most of the work takes or was created in the post-war era, so 1960s, 1970s, and really comes from the counterculture movement in the United States. There is one loan, which I will point out when we get to it, and let me begin. So the show is in our Dewey Gallery, and I'm going to include some installation shots to hopefully give you a feel of what the show looks like, and also details of works on view. So the show, What We Do in the Shadows, shadows is a metaphorical place. It's, shadows are literal, but shadows can be this place where malicious activity can occur, but also good, and communities can flourish without violent eyes or outside messaging. And so through this show, there's 3 different sections that take a look at different areas of shadows. The first section is Shadowlands, the second one is called Shadow Dwellers, and the third, Shadow Seekers. And to start off on this intro wall here, I have a photograph by the artist Shimon Ati, who was born in 1957 and created this work called Danish Jew Rescued to Sweden in 1943, with boat used in the rescue. And it's from his project Portraits of Exile from 1995. So for this project, what we see here is actually documentation of an installation he did. In Denmark, what he did is he submerged these large light boxes into the canal, and he used portraits of refugees during World War II who went to Denmark, and then also used contemporary portraits of refugees in the current day. And by putting these into the canal, he wanted people to come across these portraits and maybe start to think about the changing perception of refugees and immigrants, particularly in Denmark. And while this work was made in 1995, it still has a lot of relevance to today. As of July 2019, Denmark has enacted legislation to sell and redevelop 40% of public housing in immigrant neighborhoods. With this development, it would force residents to be rehomed or, face eviction, and effectively tear apart communities that have been built up over decades. And so this shows that justice for refugees and immigrants is still an ongoing fight today, even in places that we might see as more liberal or open or progressive. So this first section called Shadowlands, it's really looking at how lands cannot speak for themselves. These artists really take it upon themselves to give light and shed information about human misdeeds or even governmental misdeeds. So this first image here by Laura McPhee, a local Massachusetts photographer, called Burned Timber, 4th of July Creek from 2005. Now the image is really striking. If you didn't see the title at first, you might think it is a forest covered in snow, when in fact it's ash from a forest fire that was started while she was at an artist residency in Idaho. And you can see the ash covering the grounds, the tree limbs, and also the plume of smoke in the background. And a few years later, in 2007, McPhee returned to Idaho, to the same forest, to document what the forest looked like then. The trees still bear the scars of this man-made forest fire, with their charred trunks and their lack of vegetation and greenery, but you do see the resilience of the earth come through at the bottom with the um, vegetation and shrubbery that's starting to reemerge, literally out of the ashes. And I think it makes a really poignant point that even with intentional or unintentional destruction, the earth will return or revive itself even long after humans leave the earth. And then the second series on display in this section comes from the photographer Barbara Norfleet. And so all of these photographs, there's 8 on view, but I only chose 6 to display today. They are from the series called Landscapes of the Cold War. It was created in the late 80s and early 90s, and this print is from 2005. And so for this series of works, Barbara Norfleet traveled the American South and primarily Southwest to abandoned military bases and weapon testing sites. And so you can see the various places she went to, like New Mexico, California, Nevada. And what you see here is really, you don't see a human figure, but you can tell and notice the human activity that is ongoing, from the open chain link barbed wire fences to these almost alien-like triangles that are cosmic ray measurers, to the grooves in the road that show tire marks and human activity. And by doing so, in this really beautiful series of black and white photographs, we just see the evidence of rocket research, of weapon testing, of even atomic bomb testing in the United States. When we think of the US military, we might think of foreign invasion or war abroad, and probably most likely the use of weapons abroad, but they actually did it, in the United States itself, and oftentimes in secrecy. And so she is, just showing that the things that happen abroad are also happening here in our own land. For this next section called Shadow Dwellers, this is really about artists who are choosing to photograph people who they view as being marginalized or being put into positions, put into terrible positions by unfair governments or lack of support from their communities. And so in the first alcove of Dewey Gallery, there's a set of photographs of women. And this first one by Edward Steichen is called Homeless Women, the Depression, New York. And this photograph has a really interesting history. If you know anything about Edward Steichen, you probably know of his celebrity portraits and his photographs that are really stylized, very dramatic use of lighting and use of shadows. And here he has taken on a different subject. He was commissioned by the Travelers Aid Society during the Great Depression to photograph women who would use their housing services. And these photographs would be used in advertisements so that they could promote these different social welfare services they provided. And so, he really does give the women a sense of dignity. They were paid for their time here, but we really do lose any sense of who they are or their stories or backgrounds, and they become anonymous. And so it's kind of a twofold situation where he is helping women and people learn about these free services to help them, but at the same time, we lose any connection to their actual stories. And then another image in this section is actually a self-portrait, one of the few on display here. And it's a multimedia piece by Ambreen Butt. And the work itself is called Untitled AB23, and it's from her series Home and the World from 2001. And so in this self-portrait, Butt makes herself the subject. She is really trying to examine her own identity and place in the world. She was born in Pakistan and moved to the US and, really wanted to hold on to her culture and heritage while still trying to thrive in this new place and society that she was living in. And so we see her trying to contend with that, with the American flag on her shirt, and then also the plant on top of her head, where the stems of each plant lead to a small word, like nationalism or culture, humanity. These seem to be maybe wishes that she hopes for humanity to thrive and survive, but maybe is held back by nationalism or the pervasive culture she's found herself in. And then on the back wall here, there are two sets of black and white portraits on display. Here I chose three to show you, and this is Alone, from a Boston-based artist, Blue Jones. He's primarily known more for his commercial work, but he does delve into other more journalistic or artistic pursuits, like the series that we see here. So these three portraits are from the series Final Exposure. They were made in the late 80s and early 90s. And for the project, Blue Jones and his project manager, Lori Savelle Borges, visited 14 death rows across the United States. And this series really came about from a few different points in his life. When he was a young teen, he had a conversation with his father that stuck with him for the rest of his life. He learned or heard about the death penalty on the news and brought it up to his father and was really trying to understand why this takes place. Like, why are there government sanctioned killings in the United States? And his father didn't really explain it and just said, that this is what has to happen. This has to be done. And it never really sat right with Jones. And then later on, decades later, while he was working in Japan for a commission, he was in his hotel room one night all alone, turned on the TV, and he just happened to stumble across this documentary made by some British producers, and it was about the American death row. And finally, Jones thought that he really needed to take on this project himself as an American, as someone who doesn't agree with death row, and really try to shed light on a marginalized group and give them maybe a chance for their faces to be seen and their stories to be heard. So it was a really tough project to embark on, trying to get permission from wardens, trying to connect with people on death row. And so the project did take about 6 years to complete. And in the end, he has a series of photographs, a few that we see here, and also interviews and stories of the crimes these people committed, but also his time with them, which he produced into a book. And, this is one of the only photographic projects to focus solely on death row inmates, and it clearly has continued relevance to today. And just to note, since the end of this project in 1995, there have been over 1,200 executions in the United States by federal and state governments. And Lou Jones will give a talk about this project and his artistic practice in May. So please, if you're interested in this, sign up for that as well. The other series on the back wall next to the Lou Jones portraits is the series by Marcus Halevi. It is a series of photographs, black and white photographs from 1999 and his time in Romania. They are all untitled and they come from the Bedlam portfolio. Now, the people we see here are patients of Romanian mental hospitals, and it really provides little context to the subject's lives or the conditions of the treatment centers in what we see here. But in the photographs that I chose not to display, and the ones that are used for advertisements or for to shed light on the situation in Romania, they are really horrendous and cruel photographs. They're very hard to take in and to look at. There was a big movement in the 90s to help Romanian mental hospital patients and try to improve the living situations. They were really kept in inhumane conditions, dirty rooms and beds, sometimes put into cages. And so Halevi used his artwork to try to shed light on this. And he did work with Free Romania Foundation to raise awareness about these human rights violations. But there is, another side to bring up, and that's the idea of consent. These people, are they able to communicate with Halevi? Did they speak English? Are they even able to give consent to such a thing to be photographed? And also the works being untitled, there's no way for us to know who these people are, their stories are, what they're up to now. And so I think in this section, especially people who are not a part of these marginalized communities, it's important to think about what are the outside conditions that led to them creating this work? Are they in communication with these groups in trouble? They most likely had the best intentions, but it really helps to have more context. And then in the alcove over here, we have a series of works by the artist Leonard Baskin, and they all come from his Indian 4 suite, created in 1972. These lithographs are a part of a larger series, but also just theme that Baskin really delved into during starting in the early 70s. So in the late 60s, the National Park Service actually commissioned Baskin to illustrate a handbook for what was then called the Custer Battlefield, but is now known as the Little Bighorn Battlefield, to commemorate a Lakota victory over the United States Army. And so during his research of Colonel Custer and the battle, Baskin really, he says plainly that he came to have an intense hatred of Custer and a deep admiration for the Lakota people who destroyed Custer. And so being moved equally by his research as well as the rising American Indian movement, which started in the late 60s, Baskin spent decades looking and creating prints and drawings of 19th century indigenous chieftains, a few which we see on view here. And these portraits primarily came from photographs taken in the 1900s. And what he tried to do was imbue them with a sense of dignity, of respect, and really, almost make them like royalty, or just present them in a new way that maybe hopefully condemned the noble savage trope of Native Americans seen in American and Western art. And then lastly, the final section, called Shadow Seekers, is about artists and groups who align themselves with movements that explicitly fight against the status quo. The anti-war and anti-racist artists in this section have spent years using their artwork or physically protesting and fighting for the rights and dignity of oppressed groups. And so all of these themes really play out in the works that they choose to create and why they created them. So to start off is a series of prints by the artist Ben Shahn, and it comes from the series 3 Civil Rights Workers, made in 1965. So these 3 people, some of you may recognize them or be familiar with the names, but for those who aren't, these 3 men, during the Freedom Summer in 1964, traveled or lived in the American South, in particular Mississippi. And during that time, they were helping with voter registration drives to register and increase the number of Black voters in the South. And during this time, these three men went to a smaller town on their own to help the drive, and unfortunately they were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan while they were in Mississippi. And so the images of these men really became a cry and almost a catalyst, or at least one catalyst in the civil rights movement, to draw attention to voter suppression in the South and the violence the Ku Klux Klan would enact and incite against not only Black Americans, but also those advocating for the rights of Black Americans. And I think that we can really connect these themes of voter suppression to things happening today. In particular, you can look to Georgia and the recent passing of voter suppression laws, and also other southern states move to pass and enact legislation that disproportionately affects non-white communities and non-white voters. And so here's just an image of this installation. And so moving to the salon hang in the middle, this group of prints is really fascinating and really special to Massachusetts, and especially the Boston artist activist community. And so in 1968, a series of 25 prints was put together by the Boston group Artists Against Racism and the War in the spring of 1968. And the aims of this group were to draw attention to anti-racist movements and also draw attention to anti-Vietnam War movements. And so the group of artists here put their own political and activist agenda at the forefront of their work. And they were also part of a larger print revival in contemporary art, especially in response to counterculture movements. And according to Michael Mazur, one of the co-founders of AARW, he said that Boston had never seen such activism from the arts community before. And then the creation of this group also led to more interracial, politically minded arts groups in the Boston area, including even the Boston Center for the Arts, which is still operating today. And so the three prints on display here, I was trying to give you a sense of the different modes of working and the different themes and ways of representation that artists chose to submit to the portfolio. So we see really a wide array of works, from pop art to abstract expressionism, and to also collage and screen printing work at the end. And just to highlight a few more works that are more explicitly anti-racist, I chose these three here. So the work in the middle is by Michael Mazur, like I said, one of the co-founders of AARW. And this work really comes from Mazur's own interest in Dante's Inferno, and is a study for future Inferno series that he would create. And so we see the work in the middle is divided into three bands, which potentially refer to the three circles of hell explained by Virgil in this section of the Divine Comedy, which is Canto 6. And so, this work doesn't explicitly address anti-racist notions as compared to the two works around it, but Mazur was really involved with AARW and programming events and activities in the Boston area. In particular, the group AARW held a series of events and programs called the 15 Days of May. And through that, they had poetry readings, exhibitions, art making, and just a lot of other activities to engage with the community around these ideas. And Mazur, in particular, created one of the most notable exhibitions during the 15 Days of May called the American Way Room. And this is really one of the things that's looked to a reference in regards to this group. And the American Way Room when visitors would enter the gallery, they would look down and see small photographs that slowly became larger and larger as they walked through. And the images then became visible, and you could figure out what you were walking on, which were photographs of Vietnam peasants. And at the same time, at the eye level around the room, Mazur juxtaposed images of picnics, of people enjoying time outside in the summer, alongside really violent images of bombings and violence against Vietnam peasants. And he was just trying to draw attention to the way that Americans are able to really remove themselves from the actions and activities of the American military, even when horrendous violence is enacted upon different people. And then looking at the image on the right by Dana C. Chandler Jr., who also goes by Akin Duro, the title is Black People Break Free of the Suckers MFing White Egg. And so this one is, clearly a call and a reference to the Black Power movement, really seen through the raised Black fist in the middle of the scene. And it's really just capturing the energy that the Black Power movement was moving towards in the late 60s. And Chandler himself had firsthand witnessed police violence against Black Bostonians. And he, in particular, recalls a moment in 1967 where he saw the violence enacted against a young Black woman, and that really changed his perspective. And he saw that his art was a way to call to the injustices against Black people, and really started to refer to his work as activist art. And I think here in some of the other pieces on display, we can see maybe a connection to other cultures and communities, activist or political art, in using lithography and having a pared down palette of just blacks and whites and grays and bold compositions to really have the message come across. We can look to Mexico, China, and Russia for other examples of artists using this really simple yet direct and strong language to convey their thoughts and feelings. And then lastly here, the image on the left by Gary Rickson is called Sickly. And this is, a really somber image that we can see. The print really just displays the reality of Black Americans before and during the Civil Rights Movement. And what we see in the center of the image is a Black figure holding their arms up and looking upward. We see a target on their shoulder, and at the very top of their outstretched limbs, there's a small house and a figure hanging. From the target to the writing that's also dangling from this house, we can see that there's no place, even the home, that is safe for Black Americans in the face of racial violence. And, even though this subject matter is more intense or darker than the others, Rickson's work, not seen here, also really uplifted Black voices. His impact on the Black arts community in Boston is seen through his time as president of the Boston Negro Artists Association, and also the Roxbury mural Africa is the Beginning, which was made in 1969. And you may have seen, if you saw Sam Adams' show, Transcendental Modernism, this past fall. And so some of the final works in this series, or rather in the show and on this wall, I have this piece here by Nancy Burson called Visualize This from 1991. So this was actually a poster that Nancy created in collaboration with a scientist. And here what we see on the left is the depiction of a healthy T cell, and on the right, a T cell infected with HIV. And Burson wanted to literally visualize the invisible killer that would infect over 200,000 people by the time this poster was created. And she was trying to combat the stereotypes or myths around HIV and AIDS, while also really being ashamed of the government's response to the AIDS crisis. Even 30 years later, it's estimated that over 1 million Americans still live with AIDS. And so with this poster, she actually took on the role of a teacher, and she pasted it around New York City to hopefully inform and educate the broader public in the absence of information and aid from the government and public health officials. Oh, and lastly, I'm sorry for this blurry image, but the final piece of the show is by Warrington Colescott called Washington Video Game, Poker Night at the Pentagon from 1981. And so this work is rather different from many of the other pieces on display here. What Colescott, or why I chose to include it, is because Colescott uses a sense of humor and irony to attack the American and US government. And so we see an arcade game, a poker table, and various military officials or suited government individuals partaking in really frivolous or careless activities as they play games and smoke. And Colescott sees that his use of humor and irony is a way to address the United States' use of force and war in place of diplomacy. He was really angered by the Reagan administration and at that time the renewed Cold War that seemed to be on the horizon. And so what he does here is he levels the governing administration and says that they're playing around here with arcade games and poker in really a blasé way, the same way that they conduct official business and enact war and occupation. Great. So that is actually the end of my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. I don't see any comments or questions in the chat or Q&A, but feel free to send them my way right now. I do thank you all for joining me. I can stay on a few more minutes to see if anything comes through. But I do hope you all get to come out to deCordova and see the show in person. Oh, Karen Krasinski, an old professor of mine. Thank you for joining, Karen. She really loved The Prince. Oh, and thank you, Maureen. Please, also, you can feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about the exhibit. I'm happy to answer them in more detail. And I really wish, I did this talk virtually instead of in person, but I would have much rather shared this with you all in person and given a tour. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Sarah Montrose. I'm going to share the link for the Lou Jones event in the chat with you all in case you're interested in attending. It's May 13th, and he'll present on his work for this series, and he really is fascinating to talk to. We spoke in the lead up to my exhibition, and he has really a lot to say about the death row and the criminal justice system in the United States and the work he did for his series. Thank you, Gail. I hope you get to see it soon. I'm glad to share what I learned and the knowledge I have. And, I really do hope you all reach out to me if you know more or if you have any other insights. I see this show as just a starting off point. It's not meant to provide you with everything, but hopefully to give you some context or make you think deeper about subjects you might not have before. Okay, I'm going to end it now. Thank you all. I'll see you. Bye.